Hey everyone, Corey from Aquarium Co-op. Today we're going to answer the question, why do we change water? In the hobby, it's kind of just you change water to keep fish. That's what you have to do, or at least that's what we're told. And so I want to go over some of the reasons why we might change water, why we might not, that type of thing. I think we can all agree that if water is unsuitable for fish to live in, they will die. That's a pretty common known thing. But what makes water unsuitable? That I think we're taking a lot of leaps in logic. So when I read studies about individual groups of fish that have been tested against, let's say, one water parameter, which would be nitrates, like the fathead minnow, I believe during the lab testing it was lethal at about 800 parts per million. Now, I don't think I read that the long-term effects of, let's say, 400 or 600 parts per million of nitrate. So we don't know long-term, but we can hazard a guess that if 800 is deadly, something near that would be deadly maybe a little bit longer, so like maybe it takes 4 weeks at 600 and maybe it takes 1 week at 800 type of deal. So we know that we probably want to limit things from getting too out of control, and that could be nitrates. We definitely know we have to do it with nitrite or ammonia. Either one of those we know is deadly at much lower levels of toxicity. But we might have things like copper, lead, maybe fluoride. Who knows, right? Like, I don't even know if that's poisonous or not. I just know it's in my water. We know that chlorine in high enough concentrations can be deadly. We know that chloramine also is the same thing. So we know that we have to limit some stuff that's in our water. And then there's all these other things we don't even test for or think about, like maybe hormones. Is that bad, not bad? Lingering medications, maybe bad, maybe not. So I think the first thing is we need to get away from you own this fish, and so that means you change water this way. Or your tank is this big, I would do this. So to put that in perspective, a lot of times if you said, I have a betta in a bowl, and you ask the internet, how often should I change water? People might say daily. They might say every other day. They might say once a week. Some people might say, yep, you're going to do 100% water change. Some might say just 20 or 30%. Some might say, well, I only have to do it once a month. And so there's a lot of variation there. And so this question or this topic stems from questions I get regularly. And today, someone asked me the question. He said, you know what? I'm going to make this video because I want to have a video that I can refer people to, because it's a lot of typing to convey this message. So their question is, I have 6 of this fish, I have 2 of these and 4 of those, and I want to get 6 more of those. How much water change and how often should I do? And the problem is that is going to be different for every type of water source out there. So if you have the water that I have here in Washington, that answer is different than if you live in Texas, or maybe you live in Wisconsin, or maybe you're on well water, maybe you're on city water, maybe you're collecting it from a local river. Like, there's all these scenarios that can actually happen. In my locale where I am, the ones that I typically run into are tap water, well water, and then we have like an artesian well that a lot of people want to go get their water from, and it makes some sense. And we're going to talk about all those things today. So I think the easiest one is our tap water, right? We turn a knob and water comes out. Pretty cool. But we do have things like chlorine or chloramine typically, and we have fluoride in there. And then we have levels, like at least I can read on my water reports, of lead, copper, other things in there, bacteria. There's all these things that are in our water. And, the EPA limit even is 10 parts per million of nitrate. So I know there's places in LA and things like that where nitrates are actually coming out of the tap water, and that can make your plants go crazy. But maybe if you're trying to run your discus tank at 0 nitrates, it's an impossible situation for you without the use of plants. So here where I'm from, I use tap water. It's almost RO water for me. And what that means is reverse osmosis. We've stripped out all minerals, that kind of stuff. So my water looks at about 6.8 pH, 0 hardness, 0 alkalinity, so the buffering capacity, and we have no ammonia, nitrite, and very, very little chlorine in the water. Now, when you use a TDS meter, which is, we've done videos about that. We'll put a video up here, which TDS kind of means nothing, kind of means something. We'll put a video link to that. It measures out at somewhere between 23 and 29, which is very, very low conductivity to water. Now, if you add hard water, where you're getting, let's say, mineral deposits on your sink and your toilet and that type of thing, where you get that white stuff on there, you might be getting a TDS or a water hardness of 700 or something like that. And that water is going to act a lot differently than my soft acidic water will. So much so that you take, the same fish, you put them in both waters, different water change schedules and things like that would for sure come into play. So really, this video is going to be about devising a system of changing water for your aquariums. Now, for me, that starts with monitoring it. I use test strips. There's videos for that. We've done that comparison. You can use liquid test kits. Use whatever you're comfortable with. That's the important part. And we want to test our water kind of like once a week for 6 weeks or so. We want to really see like what's happening on a weekly basis. Are we building nitrates or are we losing them? Is pH going up or is it going down? Are we having ammonia problems or aren't we? We want to just know what the aquarium is doing. And then once we've collected data over those 6 weeks, we can go, okay, so now I know what my tank does in 6 weeks. How do I make it so it mostly sits at a 0 level? So what does that mean? That means that we're not raising up and we're not going down. So think of it as a scale of, maybe nitrates are rising and pH is going down. The goal would be that we just always sit at this middle level and forever it is the same. That would be our ultimate goal. Now, if you had water that lended itself to that, that's really helpful. My water doesn't really lend itself to that, so it's not as helpful as maybe someone else's. But let's say we realize we are building 20 parts per million nitrates every week. After 6 weeks, we're at 120. Most likely all our fish are still alive. Maybe they're acting a little bit differently. Maybe they're not acting differently at all. But I know that if I continue that path, next week we're going to be 140. And then we're going to be at 160 and 180 and so on. Eventually, it will get to a point, and with it being so much excess, stuff will be dying. And maybe we will lose a type of tetra first, and then a month and a half later we lose a Corridora, and then a month and a half later we're losing angels. Like, it affects different species of fish differently. So if I know I'm making 20 parts per million, and I'm going to need to counteract that, my options are I could change water every week. Let's say I changed 10% of the water every single week. It makes sense, and then it doesn't make sense at the same time. So if I have 120 parts per million and I change 10% of my water, next week we still make 20 parts per million nitrate. It will still keep going up. So in that scenario, 10% will not be a big enough difference on a weekly basis to keep it at that 0 level we want. So we might have to up it to like 20 or 30%, right? So if we go to 30%, we're going to remove 30% of, or basically about 1/3. We're going to remove 1/3 of 120, which is going to be 40. And we only make 20. So if we do that water change every week, we're going to realize we're going to go from like 120 to 80. Then we'll go to 100. Then we're going to change 30%. We're going to go to 70, right? Or 33%, 66, whatever you want to call it. Then we're going to gain 20. Then we're going to change 30%. So you can see over a long period of time, that would eventually hit almost 0 or keep it pretty low. That schedule might be awesome. You might go, great, I love changing water every week, 30% or 33%. It's going to work out great for me. Now, you could also say, like, well, what if we did it once a month, right? So we've got 120 parts per million nitrate. We change 50%, and that brings us to 60. And then we go for 4 weeks. We're going to add 80 parts per million. We're going to be at 140 again. But then if we change 50%, it's going to go back down to 70, and we'd see we'd be falling behind a little bit. Now, we ran through 2 scenarios there. The reality is your scenario is not going to be anything like that. It's going to go, oh, well, I make 7 nitrates a week, or I do this. And so really, you got to do a little bit of playing around and figure out, like, oh yeah, I'm going to do it about once a month for a couple of months. Let's say you do it for 3 months, and see where your nitrates land. Are your nitrates still at 120, or are they at 180, or are they sitting at 30? At 30, I'd be going, hey, this aquarium's running pretty good. I consider anywhere between 20 and 40 to be a pretty good indication of an aquarium. Think of it like a like a workload at work. If you work 40 hours, you're probably doing okay. You start working more than 40 hours, starts getting stressful. You work way too little hours, and maybe you're not making enough food for things to live. And so those things that would be living would be algae and plants. So if we run at zero all the time, we might not be able to grow those, which some people might hate algae and plants. Then that would be a way to accomplish that. Now, we've talked to this point so far basically about how water changes can help fix water quality. Now, while that is true, we're fixing those nitrates. Imagine we add another problem into the mix. So with my tap water, I have very low pH. Let's say I like to keep most of my fish at 7.2 to 7.5 pH, and we know that my tap water is about 6.8. Every time I do a water change, it's going to change that pH a little bit. So if I do big water changes, we're going to have big swings in the pH. If I do little water changes, we'll have very small fluctuations, but in one example, the 10% wouldn't work. The 30% work, maybe that's going to work, but realize that water changes aren't always a good thing. So the other thing we could think about is if we're bringing in fluoride, maybe fluoride's not good. I haven't really read any studies that says it isn't good, but I do kind of adhere to a school of thought of the less things that's in the water, I think, is better. That wouldn't be kind of natural, if you will. So we have chlorine in there. We're going to have copper. We're going to have lead. We're going to have fluoride. We're going to have all these other things. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use a dechlorinator to either break the bond on that chloramine or chlorine, and then we're going to have more chemicals in there. We might even be introducing ammonia at that point. So it might fix one thing, nitrates, but we might be limiting or hurting on another thing of making some ammonia that a good dechlorinator should lock up and the aquarium should handle. But we also might be leaving other chemicals in the aquarium that could build up long term, and everything is toxic at a certain level. So for instance, as a human, if I just drink way too much water, way too much water, way too much water, way too much water, I can actually die from that. Even though without water, I will also die. And the same thing happens in aquariums. Like shrimp, for instance, a lot of people are worried that they have copper in their water and it's going to kill them. Well, if those shrimp never get any copper ever, they will also die from not getting any copper. So we need right amounts of things, and that's what we're shooting for. And the general wisdom I find online is that we shoot for the shotgun approach of just change a bunch of water and mostly you'll be okay. And I would say for most people, that probably is a true statement. But what if we could save a bunch of time? What if we could save a little bit of stress? What if we could become more advanced aquarists, and instead of keeping fish, we keep ecosystems? And that's what I'm always striving to do. At the store, we have very heavy stock loads. We change water 4 times a day. It adds up to about a 10% water change. It works out really well. That same routine here is worked out to I'm kind of wasting a lot of water, and I'm really struggling to grow plants because I don't have enough nutrients in that water. So I want to start relaxing it here because the store as an entity and my home aquariums as an entity act very differently. And so I want to devise a system. So I'm going to track nitrates, and I'm going to do water changes that I think will help loosen that or alleviate it a little bit. But I really want plants to help me with that. Plants are nature's design to absorb all these extra things. So long term, they're going to absorb lead, copper, ammonia, nitrite, nitrate, all these things that are in our aquariums anyway. And so plants can really help, but not all fish allow that. But I like to use them in most of my ecosystems to help me balance this out. Now, if I can use plants, I can use less water. And when I think about an aquarium, which is an ecosystem, there's really only 4 ways, I think. About 4 ways we introduce things to our aquarium, right? So 1, we have food. That's the most common one. We're feeding our aquarium. We're feeding our fish. But really, I like to think about it, we're feeding the whole aquarium. So we're feeding the aquarium, and we're going to bring in whatever that food has in it. So if it has iron in it, it's bringing in iron. If it has boron, if it has, the end product being nitrates, all those things come in. If we put in, krill, all the things that come with krill come into that water, all the oils, everything, right? We could also put in fertilizers, food for plants. That also would bring stuff in, right? So food for that ecosystem is the number 1 source because we tend to do that every day or at least every week. The other source is the water change. A lot of us will change water every day, every week, at least every month. And with that, we're bringing in chlorine, we're bringing in water additives, whether it's dechlorinator, maybe it's live bacteria, maybe it's hardness or buffering capacity. All those things come in. So that's another way we add stuff to water. And then we have things like fish. When you buy a new fish or a plant, when you bring that into the system, it brings some stuff with it. Could bring parasites, could bring bacterias, could just bring nutrients. Let's say you brought a plant that had absorbed a lot of iron, and then that plant dies in your aquarium. Well, all that iron over time gets released back into your system. So we're introducing things that way as well. I would say not as frequently, though. Maybe we add fish once a month, in a long established tank. Maybe it's once a year, once every few years. And then the last one is like contaminant that we can't control, and that's dust falling in. It's a kid puts something in the tank, the cat knocks something in, that kind of stuff we can't really control. But I think we can control the water, and we can control the food. And a lot of us, we spend a lot of money and a lot of time researching foods, figuring out what we want to feed, right? And we don't spend that much time in the water sector of it, though. We go, well, I'll just change a bunch of water, and that's good. But as we've established, changing water for everyone's not always a good thing. And, so I think if we can control the water change part of it as well, and at least minimize it, right? So we minimize the food. We put in as much food as those fish need to live and eat and be healthy. With water changes, we go, well, water's pretty cheap. We'll change a lot of water all the time. But what if that water is bringing a little bit of stress to them every time we do it? Which I know it does because I've seen it, and I've had tanks that I've bred fish for years without changing water, or like crystal shrimp and things like that. Usually fish or living things want water parameters they prefer, not necessarily fresh water. Now, that can help spawn some stuff sometimes, to trigger them. But the reality is fish, in a perfect scenario, they want to live in the water parameters they want forever and never have it change at all. In reality, in our ecosystems we built, we have to change some water at some point because we'll run into deficiencies. Now, there are systems we can build where we'll never actually exchange any water. Charles Clapsaddle is a perfect example of that at Goliad Farms. He never takes water out of the system short of begging up fish to sell them. Other than that, it's all plant filtration, and every week he has to replace 2% of the water from the tap, or I think he's actually on a well, from the well to his fish farm from evaporation and things like that. But all the excess calcium and all that kind of stuff is taken up by the plants, and eventually those plants have to get trimmed because they're getting too big, and they get put on a compost pile, and they leave the system. So we can develop systems like that, but for us that own 1 to 10 aquariums in our homes, we're probably not going to have the time to dial in each system that way. So I'm just trying to bring us back from the extreme of let's change water all day long, every day, into let's monitor our ecosystem and change water appropriately to what we can measure. Now, there's a lot of things we can't measure. We can't measure hormones. There's a ton of things in the water we just won't be able to test. You could live in fear of those. I myself haven't had a problem. Most people, I would say, don't. If you're really trying to raise that batch of angelfish or that batch of rams or whatever it is, go ahead and change that extra water, but just be aware of the fact that maybe there is some bad things to that water change as well. And there's always a chance that on that day, and you see this happen all the time online, extra stuff was put into the water because they found a contaminant, and then we change our water. We don't get notified, and we don't put enough dechlorinator in, or something goes wrong, and we lose a bunch of fish. So there's always that, problem there, and it might only be a 3% chance, So it's very low that every time you change water, so low are the odds you're going to have a problem. But it is there. So why not minimize the amount of work we're doing? We're spending money on water, and we're causing some stress to save all those things and save time. So that's what I do. I'm actively working, I've been doing it for a couple years, lessen the amount of water changes I do, and keep water quality at the same parameters that I think are correct. Now, what you think are correct and what I think are correct are two different things. What you and I think are correct and what the fish think are correct are two different things. And so this is really a self-searching type of topic. You can't really ask your neighbor down the street. You can't ask that guy, the guy that bred them. We all have different water. We all have different ecosystems. We have to go on this quest ourselves to find what schedule is going to work really well for our system. And the saltwater world tends to be really good at this. The saltwater world goes, what are we missing in this aquarium? Or what's this water missing? Great. We will correct that because saltwater is expensive. In freshwater, water is cheap. Instead, we go, let's just change a bunch of water. We don't need to know what we were missing. And so we can miss a lot of things for a very long amount of time. And that's where we get into some things where we're like, oh, why are my guppies, why are they having crooked backs and stuff like that? Like, oh, we had no calcium in your water for the last year and a half. But I was changing tons of water. Doesn't mean the water had calcium in it. And so there's all these things. And I maintain it's much better that we are informed on what is in our water and actively monitoring it than just hoping that our water never changes. I know for sure where I live, water changes between summer and winter for dang sure. And so I tend to do things like I have crushed coral. I use some additives. I do things like that to try and not rely on the water change nearly as much. And I typically don't play with fish that are on the extreme. So anything that needs a pH down in the 5s to breed, something like that. Really, I don't want to play with that because it's really hard to keep the water there. And my tap water is so different than that it makes it difficult. So the takeaway is, why do we change water? To combat elevated levels of anything. Most commonly, waste, nitrite, nitrate, ammonia. That being said, we could use some plants to alleviate that. We could use some chemical ways to do that. And let's not change water for the sake of changing water. Let's have a purpose. And if you have a purpose, and it might say that, yep, you have to change water every day in that goldfish aquarium because the load is so heavy and that makes sense, great. But I think a lot of us are going to find that turns out I could relax my water change schedule and everything was better. Fish acted better. Plants acted better. I was doing it just because that was the common wisdom and I wasn't necessarily having problems. But you might notice you're actually doing better. Now, don't go crazy. Corey said don't do water changes. And so now I'm never going to do a water change again. How about we pick one tank. We start studying it. We start tracking it for 6 weeks. We don't let anything get too crazy. If by week 3 your nitrates are 500, do a water change, right? Like, let's not go way off the beaten path. But let's see how long you could go. Take an aquarium. Let's say it's at 10 parts per million nitrates. See how long it takes to get to 40. When you hit 40... look how long it took, then make an educated decision. How much water do I think I'd have to change so that it would never go above 40 and might sit around 20 or 25? And then when you have that plan, run that for a few months and go, wow, this tank is really doing well. I don't have cyanobacteria. I don't have this going on anymore. Like, weird. And then maybe tackle another tank. And eventually you'll have them all in a row doing what they need to do. And I know most people right now, they go, it's Sunday, I'm going to do all my water changes, or it's Tuesday, I'm going to do that. And the reality is that tank probably needs a water change every 6 days. That one needs it every 2 months. That one needs it every 3 weeks. That one over there needs it every 10 days. And so we just lump them all together so it's easy for us to remember, but that's not necessarily what's best. And we might be able to go, well, maybe I'll just change the stocking in this aquarium a little bit, add a couple plants in that one, and then I could do them all at the 2-week mark. Maybe something like that makes sense. But going away from this conversation, be informed about your tank, know your water parameters. So often I interact with you guys and you literally have no idea. I don't know what my pH is. I don't know in a test kit. These are some of the basic things that while they're not fun, they are one of the most important. If you can maintain really stable water for long periods of time, you will be that person in the club or that is on Facebook or whatever. And you're like, wow, that fish is 28 years old. And you go, yeah, all I do is, I don't do a whole lot. Whenever you talk to the old guys that really have old fish and been doing it a long time, you'll hear that. I don't do a whole lot. They're easy. It's almost like the less you do, the better. Avoiding the extremes, obviously. So hopefully you enjoyed and you're going to come away from this thinking about water and an ecosystem differently than just, I'm going to stick to my 50% water change once a week and hope for the best. And it might be you need 50%, but at least have data to back it up for you so that you can be confident you made the right water change decision in that aquarium. So we'll see you next time. Thanks for hanging out, guys, and good luck. Thanks for subscribing. On the left, we have our latest video. Make sure you check that out. On the right, we have more videos lined up for you, which we think you'll enjoy if you enjoyed this video. Down below, we have the Jimmy of Aquarium Co-op channel. Make sure you check that out, and we'll see you in the next one.